at Pearl Harbor stretched quiet in the autumn of 1945, transformed from the site of devastating attack to a sprawling Victory anchorage. Row upon row of gray submarines rode at their moorings, their conning towers bearing the painted silhouettes of merchant vessels sunk, warships destroyed, and missions completed. These boats had strangled Japan's maritime lifelines, sent millions of tons to the bottom, and turned the Pacific into an American lake. Now they sat idle, their crews demobilized, their future uncertain. Similar scenes played out at Mare Island, Portsmouth, and Philadelphia, where submarine pens designed for wartime production stood suddenly empty of purpose. The United States Navy found itself custodian of the world's largest and most capable submarine fleet, over 200 boats, many nearly new, all rendered strategically obsolete the moment Japan signed the surrender documents. The question facing naval planners was stark. What does one do with an entire fleet built for a war that no longer exists? By September 1945, the numbers presented an overwhelming challenge. The Navy had commissioned 203 fleet submarines during the war years, alongside dozens of older S-class boats from the previous conflict. Production had reached industrial scale at yards across the nation. Electric Boat in Groton, Mare Island in California, Portsmouth in New Hampshire, and Manitowoc in Wisconsin had turned out boats with assembly line efficiency. The Gato, Balao, and Tench classes represented the most successful submarine design in naval history. But success in war provides no guarantee of peace. These boats consumed resources, required maintenance, and demanded crews the Navy could no longer justify. The fleet submarines, designed for 75-man crews and extended Pacific patrols, seemed ill-suited for a world divided between atomic superpowers. Yet within this surplus fleet lay technologies and capabilities that would prove essential to the emerging Cold War. The challenge was determining which boats deserved preservation, which served better as test platforms, and which should face the cutter's torch. The immediate post-war situation created unprecedented logistical strain. Submarine bases from Connecticut to California overflowed with returned boats, each requiring demobilization, preservation work, and security. The Navy's Bureau of Ships faced maintaining hundreds of complex vessels, whilst Congress slashed appropriations and demanded rapid demobilization. At Mare Island alone, over 40 fleet submarines lay nested together, their batteries disconnected, their diesel fuel drained, their compartments open to prevent corrosion. Similar concentrations existed at Pearl Harbor, where boats rotated home from forward bases in Guam and Midway, and at Philadelphia, where Atlantic-based submarines gathered. The variety of conditions complicated planning. Some boats had completed war patrols just weeks earlier and remained in excellent condition, whilst others showed years of hard service, their hulls worn, their equipment outdated by rapid wartime improvements. The Navy initially placed most submarines in Red Lead Row, a preservation status that maintained basic material condition whilst deferring final decisions about their fate. The American approach to its submarine surplus reflected both immediate practical needs and emerging strategic realities. Unlike the rapid disposal of merchant shipping or the wholesale scrapping of escort carriers, submarines received more careful consideration. The Navy recognized that future conflicts might require underwater capabilities, even if the nature of those conflicts remained unclear. In 1945, the service divided its fleet boats into several categories: active units for the peacetime Navy, reserve vessels maintained in preservable condition, training boats for schools and experimental work, and surplus hulls destined for disposal. This classification system evolved over several years as Cold War requirements crystallized. Initially, the Navy retained approximately 70 fleet submarines in active commission, a number that seemed generous given budget constraints, but modest compared to wartime strength. These boats received the newest equipment, the best crews, and priority for modifications. Another 100 submarines entered the reserve fleet, concentrated at Mare Island, New London, and Philadelphia. These boats underwent preservation procedures, coating with protective compounds, sealing openings, installing dehumidification equipment designed to maintain them in potentially restorable condition. The testing and experimental programs consumed substantial numbers of otherwise surplus submarines. The Navy's appetite for technical development, constrained during wartime by production priorities, expanded dramatically after 1945. The submarine service wanted to understand high-speed underwater performance, explore new propulsion systems, test advanced sonar and fire control equipment, and validate revolutionary hull designs. The capture of German Type 21 submarines provided comparative data and inspired American programs. But domestic boats served as the primary test platforms. Ostench became a research vessel for the David Taylor Model Basin, conducting experiments on hull coatings, control surfaces, and pressure hull modifications. Osterbo received extensive streamlining in 1948, her external fittings removed or faired, her decks modified, transforming her into the fastest conventionally powered submarine in the world. These GUPPY modifications, Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, revolutionized submarine design by prioritizing submerged performance over surface capability. Between 1946 and 1951, 52 fleet submarines received GUPPY conversions of varying extent, gaining streamlined fairings, enlarged batteries, snorkel equipment, and modern sensors. The program required boats in good material condition, effectively preserving these hulls through modernization rather than mothballing. Weapons testing absorbed additional submarines in ways that ranged from technical evaluation to violent destruction. Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in July 1946, included 2 fleet submarines amongst the target vessels. Ustentuda and Skipjack rode at anchor amongst cruisers, battleships, and destroyers when the bombs detonated. Skipjack survived both airburst and underwater explosions, providing valuable data about submarine vulnerability to nuclear weapons before eventually sinking. Dentuda suffered less damage, but became too radioactive for recovery. The tests validated concerns that submarines, whilst protected by submergence from blast effects, remained vulnerable to the shock waves transmitted through water. Additional boats served as torpedo and mine test targets. Uskusk and Carbonero received modifications to launch guided missiles. Pioneering Submarine launched cruise missile systems that evolved into modern strategic weapons. The Navy's willingness to modify, test, and occasionally destroy fleet submarines reflected confidence in the basic design and recognition that understanding submarine warfare's future mattered more than preserving every hull. The British received 14 fleet submarines through various assistance programs between 1945 and 1952. The Royal Navy, devastated by war losses and constrained by economic crisis, needed modern boats whilst its own construction programs recovered. Scotsman, formerly Springer, and 13 Sisters provided training platforms and operational capability during the critical early Cold War years. The boats received British equipment and modifications, serving primarily in training roles or as experimental platforms. Some British submariners appreciated the American boats' spaciousness and reliability, whilst others found them unwieldy compared to smaller British designs. The transfers strengthened Anglo-American naval cooperation and provided valuable operational intelligence about American submarine design to British engineers. Most British-operated American submarines returned to American custody by the mid-1950s, their missions complete, though some remained longer as training vessels. Soviet interest in American submarine technology proved intense but indirect. The USSR received no direct transfers and instead relied on examination of captured German documentation and occasional examination of American boats during joint operations in 1945. Soviet intelligence services maintained active interest in American submarine capabilities throughout the late 1940s, recognizing the threat posed by advanced boats operating from Western bases. The Soviet submarine program developed along parallel lines, emphasizing mass production and operational numbers over individual boat sophistication. American awareness of Soviet submarine expansion influenced decisions about which boats to preserve and how to modify retained units. The Cold War context transformed submarine disposal from a purely economic question into a strategic calculation about maintaining technological advantage. The disposal programs began in earnest during 1946 and accelerated through the early 1950s. The Navy faced congressional pressure to reduce costs and eliminate excess capability. Older S-class submarines from the 1920s received priority for scrapping, their obsolete designs and worn-out hulls offering nothing to modern naval warfare. Between 1946 and 1948, 31 S-class boats went to scrapyards at Philadelphia, Mare Island, and Puget Sound. The process involved towing boats to commercial breaking facilities where specialized crews cut through pressure hulls, removed machinery, and reduced entire submarines to scrap metal. Fleet submarines followed as budget pressures intensified. The Navy established criteria for disposal: boats with damaged or weakened pressure hulls, boats with outdated configurations that made modernization impractical, and boats that exceeded maintenance costs relative to their value. Oose Perch suffered explosion damage during the war and received disposal orders in 1948. Oose Grenadier, scuttled and later raised, proved too expensive to restore and met the breakers in 1946. By 1950, 42 fleet submarines had been scrapped, their steel recycled, their fittings salvaged, their histories reduced to photographs and patrol reports. The methods varied somewhat by location and circumstance. Submarines destined for scrapping typically underwent partial defueling and decontamination at naval facilities before transfer to commercial scrappers. Some boats served briefly as pierside trainers, their interior spaces maintained for instruction whilst their external systems deteriorated. These training hulks provided valuable service, but eventually succumbed to corrosion and neglect. The Navy occasionally employed submarines as target vessels for weapons testing, a disposal method that generated useful data whilst eliminating surplus hulls. Oose Tuna became a target for torpedo testing in 1948, enduring multiple hits before sinking. Such tests validated new torpedo designs whilst disposing of boats no longer worth preserving. The pace of disposal reflected budgetary cycles and political pressure. Congressional appropriations committees demanded visible reductions in naval strength, viewing submarine numbers as particularly extravagant given the absence of major surface threats. The Navy complied, though it fought to retain a core modernized force and adequate reserves. Economic factors reinforced disposal decisions. Maintaining submarines in reserve status cost substantially less than active operation, but still required periodic maintenance, security, and inspections. Each boat in reserve represented an opportunity cost. The funds spent preserving it might instead support new construction or operational units. The Navy calculated that modernizing older boats through GUPPY conversion programs proved cheaper than new construction whilst providing 80% of new boat capability. This calculation saved numerous submarines that might otherwise have faced scrapping. Boats in poor material condition or with design limitations that made modernization impractical received no such reprieve. The disposal programs demonstrated remarkable efficiency. Between 1946 and 1955, the Navy reduced its submarine force from over 200 boats to fewer than 100 active and reserve units, achieving this reduction while simultaneously modernizing retained submarines and developing nuclear propulsion. Foreign military sales programs absorbed modest numbers of American fleet submarines during the 1950s and 1960s. Brazil received Oose Muscalunge and Oose Paddle in 1957, operating them as Humaita and Riachuelo until the early 1970s. Turkey received Oose Mero and Oose Threadfin in 1948, operating these boats into the 1960s whilst training crews and developing submarine capabilities. Argentina, Chile, Greece, Italy, and Peru all received American fleet submarines through various assistance programs. These transfers served Cold War containment strategy, strengthening Allied navies whilst disposing of boats the United States no longer required. The recipient nations often operated these submarines for decades, extending the service lives far beyond what American retention would have allowed. Brazilian submarine crews maintained Humaita in operational condition until 1968, 23 years after commissioning, demonstrating the fundamental soundness of American wartime submarine design. preservation efforts remained limited during the immediate post-war decades. The Navy established no formal museum program for submarines, viewing them as utilitarian craft rather than historic artifacts. Oos Bowfin found permanent preservation at Pearl Harbor in 1981, becoming one of the first museum submarines in the United States. Her preservation resulted from civilian initiative rather than Navy planning, though the service eventually supported the effort. Oos Cod, moored in Cleveland since 1959, serves as memorial and museum maintained by volunteers and open to visitors. Oos Lionfish rests in Fall River, Massachusetts, Oos Bacuna in Philadelphia, and Oos Pompanito in San Francisco. These boats represent the handful preserved from among hundreds built. Each museum submarine underwent extensive restoration to present publicly accessible spaces whilst maintaining historical accuracy. The challenge of preserving submarines exceeds that of surface ships. Their pressure hulls require protection from corrosion, both internal and external. Their battery compartments present environmental hazards, and their cramped internal spaces limit visitor access. Most preserved submarines show only forward torpedo rooms, control rooms, and after torpedo rooms to visitors, with engineering spaces and crew quarters closed or significantly modified. The discovery of previously unknown survivors occasionally adds to the preserved fleet. Archaeological surveys have located several wrecked American submarines, their loss circumstances long known but their exact positions lost. These wrecks, resting in Pacific waters or off American coasts, remain war graves and historical sites, protected under Admiralty law but inaccessible to most people. The number of substantially complete American fleet submarines surviving today stands at approximately 20 examples worldwide. This represents less than 10% of boats constructed, a survival rate comparable to other wartime vessels but nonetheless representing significant loss of material history. The submarines that survive in museums provide invaluable education about daily life aboard these boats, about the technology that enabled Pacific victory, and about the human cost of submarine warfare. Museum operators face constant challenges maintaining aging steel structures exposed to salt air and weather. Restoration projects require specialized knowledge, original equipment that grows scarcer yearly, and substantial funding. The influence of American wartime submarines on subsequent development proved profound and lasting. The GUPPY program demonstrated that streamlining and increased battery capacity could transform underwater performance, principles that guided conventional submarine design through the 1970s. The experience gained operating hundreds of boats across Pacific distances informed American strategic thinking about submarine employment in future conflicts. The fleet's submarines' range, endurance, and habitability became requirements for Cold War designs, influencing both nuclear and conventional boats. Soviet submarine development showed clear influence from American concepts, transmitted through intelligence gathering and through examination of transferred German boats that themselves reflected awareness of American capabilities. The transition from wartime fleet submarines to nuclear-powered boats like US Nautilus represented evolution rather than revolution, building on established American submarine expertise whilst adding unprecedented propulsion capabilities. The Cold War context ensured that substantial numbers of World War II fleet submarines remained available through the 1960s. The reserve fleet maintained approximately 50 boats in preservable storage until the mid-1960s, when improved Soviet submarine capabilities and American nuclear boat production finally made conventional submarines obsolete for frontline service. The last active American fleet submarine, Oos Tiru, decommissioned in 1975, 30 years after commissioning, having served primarily in training roles during her final decade. This remarkable longevity validated the basic design and demonstrated the value of robust wartime construction. The disposal of reserve fleet submarines accelerated during the 1970s as the Navy recognized that reactivation had become impractical and continued preservation unjustifiable. Between 1969 and 1976, over 40 fleet submarines left reserve status for scrapping, ending their service quietly in commercial breaking yards. The final boats to face scrapping included some of the newest Tench-class submarines, boats that had seen limited wartime service but whose conventional propulsion made them irrelevant to nuclear-powered Navy requirements. The moral and historical complexities surrounding America's submarine campaign receive ongoing attention from historians and museum professionals. The effectiveness of American submarines in destroying Japanese merchant shipping contributed decisively to Allied victory, but the human cost, Japanese sailors and civilians aboard torpedoed vessels, created ethical questions that persist decades later. Museum submarines address these complexities with varying degrees of directness, balancing celebration of American veterans' service with acknowledgement of warfare's broader impacts. The preserved boats serve as tangible connections to a historical moment when American submarine crews conducted the most successful submarine campaign in naval history, sinking over 1,300 Japanese vessels and starving Japan's war economy. That success came at considerable cost. American submarines suffered the highest casualty rate of any American service branch, with 52 boats lost and over 3,500 submariners killed. The museum boats honor this sacrifice, whilst educating visitors about submarine warfare's technical and human dimensions. The speed with which America's wartime submarine fleet vanished remained striking. Within a decade of victory, over half had been scrapped. Within 2 decades, only a handful remained in any service. The transition reflected practical necessity. Maintaining hundreds of diesel-electric submarines made no strategic or economic sense in the nuclear age. Yet the thoroughness of disposal meant that material examples of history's most successful submarine class became surprisingly rare. Each scrapped boat took with it unique details of configuration, operational wear, and wartime modification. The surviving museum boats, valuable as they are, represent perhaps 20 examples from among 203 built. Leaving substantial gaps in understanding of the class's variations. Researchers studying American submarines must rely heavily on documentation, photographs, and the limited museum examples, whilst acknowledging that most boats vanished without detailed recording. The transformation of Pearl Harbor from anchorage filled with victorious submarines to harbor hosting modern nuclear boats took less than a generation. The Gray Fleet submarines that rode at anchor in September 1945 seemed powerful and modern then, the culmination of American industrial might and engineering expertise. Yet within years they appeared outdated, their diesel engines noisy and limited, their surface-focused designs ill-suited to Cold War realities. The race to capture enemy technology that characterized Europe's post-war scramble had no Pacific equivalent. The Japanese submarine force, devastated by American action and never achieving operational success comparable to German U-boats, offered limited technical intelligence. Instead, American submarines represented the technology others sought to understand or counter. The Soviet Union studied American submarine capabilities intensively, developing countermeasures and building opposing forces. Allied nations sought American boats to modernize their own submarine services or to learn from American operational expertise. The practical challenges of disposing a submarine fleet exceeded those of surface ships in several respects. Submarines contained lead-acid batteries requiring careful removal and disposal, diesel fuel and lubricants that needed draining, and pressure-resistant structures that resisted cutting tools. Scrappers developed specialized techniques for submarine braking, often cutting boats into sections for easier handling. The process generated substantial quantities of steel, non-ferrous metals, and salvageable equipment that helped offset scrapping costs. Some boats yielded equipment transferred to other submarines or to training facilities. The complete disappearance of a submarine required only weeks once scrapping began, the steel hull reduced to pieces, the equipment distributed or destroyed, the boat's identity surviving only in records and memories. This efficiency, economically sensible and operationally necessary, meant history's preservation depended entirely on intentional action. Without organizations committed to saving representative examples, the entire class might have vanished.